The next encounter with Jesus is his baptism by John. So, if we're following the record here, that's the next event chronologically that happens since his, I'll call it a stunt at the temple that I talked about in the last video. So, the baptism would have been around 18 years since said stunt in the temple. The baptism is recounted in all four Gospels, but only Matthew records Jesus saying anything during the event. But first, let's read John's setup. However, this John utterly forbade him, Jesus, saying, "I have obligation to be baptized by you, but you come to me?" Now, utterly forbade, the word that I translated as utterly forbade, is dikaiosynen, meaning to altogether hinder, to utterly prohibit or forbid. That many prominent commentaries that I've read insist that the word here is better translated to imply like a half-heartedness, or merely he tried to hinder the process, is not keeping either with John's well-established brazenness nor with the word itself. If John didn't want something to happen, especially something related to his spiritual calling, you can bet he would not allow it to happen. John utterly forbade Jesus. Why would he do that? Because he believed he had krian to be baptized by Jesus instead. So that word most basically means employment, in the sense of you have a job to do, and thus it also implies certain demands, requirements, and needs that must be fulfilled in order for other things to happen. So John is saying, in effect, it is my duty to be baptized by you. It is my obligation to be baptized by you. So why he would say this will be explored in more detail later. But first, let's look at Jesus' answer, and then once we have kind of these two verses next to each other, I'm going to be giving explanation and background that's going to get more into who John was, what his relationship with Jesus might have been or probably was, and so forth. So Jesus' response to this, the first word in the Greek here is Aphes, which comes from apo and hemin. The former, apo, means off, and the latter, hemin, means to send. So Aphes, therefore, means to send off, but is often used to mean to lay aside, to put aside, to let go, and hence to forgive, omit, forget, etc. This is followed directly by arti, which means presently, right now, this day, but can also carry an implied from this day forward, from henceforth, starting today. So, at the very least, Jesus starts this by saying, forget about that for now, permit it for now, endure this apparent transgression for a few minutes. But he could also be saying, from now on, forget about that with me, henceforth you shall lay that aside in my case. Well, either way, why should John lay it aside this day in my case? Jesus gives an explanation for that too. In fact, half of his quote is dedicated to just prefacing his explanation. Houtos means in this way. It is a word meant to start explanations. It is followed directly by gar, which is a multi-purpose word also meant to preface explanations. This is followed by prepon, meaning proper, right, comely, befitting, etc. This is followed by ἐστιν hemin, which just simply means it is for us when they're combined together. So, he starts this by saying, in this way, indeed, it is befitting for us. Befitting for them to do what? Plerosai, pasan, dikaiosynen. Plerosai means to fulfill, to make replete. We've run into that word before. Pasan is simply all, but more in the sense of every single one of a set group. So all of the members of that group. And dikaiosynen is a bit more complicated, but this is the same word, fun trivia, that Plato uses in his famous Republic to denote justice. That's how it's usually translated, although it can also mean righteousness or equity, fairness in judgment and action. And that comes from the adjective dikaios, which is probably, not certainly, but probably from the noun dike, which is probably from the verb diknumi. Diknumi means to show. Dik then means right in the sense of what shows itself as self-evidently true, as self-evidently good, as right. This is right to do. It thus also refers, obviously, to justice, and dikaios solidifies this meaning: just, righteous, equitable, full of that thing which is self-evidently true. So, in this way, indeed, it is befitting for us to satisfy every single part of the law. In other words, believe me, John, I assure you this is right for us to do, because it is a part of the divine law, and I have to fulfill the whole divine law. Or you could even say every single line of the whole divine law. All right, so now we know the translation, but what does it actually mean? What exactly is going on here between Jesus and John? Did they even know each other before this point? What's the emotional tone here? It certainly sounds like they knew each other. It sounds like a little bit of an intense moment, but other scriptures seem to imply that John and Jesus didn't know each other, or at least that John didn't know Jesus. And what was the deal with John not wanting Jesus to get baptized? And what does Jesus' response to John mean? Why did it work? What was this Jewish guy John baptizing people in the first place for? Okay, I can't answer all of those questions at once, but let me give a short answer to give sort of a sketch of what's going on here, just so that you have that in mind as I because I'm going to go kind of all over the place to try to give more background, but I want to give you a shorter answer to start with. So the short answer is John already understood Jesus to be the prophesied Messiah, meaning he, Jesus, had far greater divine authority than John, and was to eventually take the reins of ministry from John. John was the voice crying in the wilderness to prepare the way of the Lord, of the Messiah. He cultivated a group of people to be spiritually ready for the Messiah, and that's part of what baptism was for, as we'll explain. However, John misunderstood the nature and relation of him and Jesus' different authorities, thinking that because Jesus was greater than him, then Jesus was not in any way obligated to him. Rather, it should be the other way around. John was obliged to be baptized by Jesus, not Jesus of John. Nevertheless, Jesus understood that the divine law or justice is still universal, and even the President of the United States, barring certain specific circumstances, can be pulled over by any Kansas police officer for speeding, so long as that police officer has been given the authority to do so. So that's sort of the short answer of what's going on. Now for the long answer. And to do that, we're going to have to go all the way back to John's birth. I'm not kidding. That's where I want to go, because there is some important stuff going on here. So Luke, going back to Luke, he tells us that John the Baptist was, or rather like Jesus, born under miraculous circumstances. So whereas Mary, Jesus' mother, gave birth without knowing any man, John's mother, Elizabeth, gave birth despite great age and her lifelong barrenness. So both conceptions were announced by angels, along with prophecies regarding the children's adulthood ministries as servants of God and what specifically they would be doing. Luke also tells us that Mary and Elizabeth knew each other well enough for Mary to stay with Elizabeth during their mutual pregnancies. Mary was also close enough with Elizabeth that the angel Gabriel could use Elizabeth's miraculous pregnancy as a meaningful example to comfort Mary during the Annunciation. That wouldn't really mean as much if Mary did not know Elizabeth well enough to just recognize her by name and know what the angel was referring to. So anyway, that seems to me to clearly mean that Mary and Elizabeth knew each other, and they knew each other very well, or they had strong connections. Now, these two facts give weight and meaning to the word which Luke gives to describe their relation. He uses the word syngenes. That word is a tense of sugenes, which comes from sun and genes. Sun is a preposition denoting union, i.e. with or together. Genes comes from the verb ginomai, which means to cause to be, to bring into being. This is made into the noun genus, meaning kin, and in this sense that one is of the same stock, in the same group, caused by the same thing, of the same essential derivation, whether biologically, conceptually, etc. So, sougenes means united by shared derivation, or simply their kinsmen, their relatives, their fellows, their cousins. There is nothing in the word, however, that has to denote blood relation, but it does necessarily denote that there was a close relationship of some kind, and there was a shared derivation of some kind. And I think from the evidence seen before that had to have had a strong emotional component to it. Now, it also seems, interestingly, that Jesus and John knew each other before their births, for Luke explains that the unborn John ἐστιν in Elizabeth's womb, that is, he leaped for joy, he was quickened out of happy excitement, upon comprehending some evidence of Jesus' presence in Mary's nearby womb. But did they know each other after their births? This is a hard question to answer from the record, because there is no explicit mention of these two meeting until Jesus' baptism. However, in order for the exchange in Matthew to take place, it seems to be necessary that John understand Jesus to be superior to him in some spiritual way. And it is possible that John spiritually perceived Jesus' character as he came down into the water. Having never met him before, he just was like, oh, there he is. Wait, but that means that why on earth should I be baptizing him? But I don't think that's the most plausible explanation. More likely, given the fact that Mary and Elizabeth knew each other so well and had these experiences, John would have already known Jesus well enough to make such conclusions about him for himself. They had to have talked about things beforehand. Furthermore, like I mentioned, it seems impossible to me that Mary and Elizabeth, given their relationship so far, and by the way, their miraculous experiences upon meeting during their pregnancies, it was a common attack against Christians by the Romans, as I understand it, to point out that Jesus was like a bastard son, because no one believed, no one was going to think that Mary was impregnated ex nihilo, as it seems to have happened. Like, no one in their right mind believes that. At the time, without some kind of great spiritual confirmation, because that's crazy sounding. That's the whole point, is that it's crazy sounding, and you have to have some kind of spiritual confirmation. So obviously everybody thought that she had slept with some soldier or something. That was actually one of the prevailing theories, if I've heard right, from some of the Romans, is that they were like, we even know who the Roman soldier was, and they give out the name and so forth. And it's so Mary had to deal with this stuff all her life, of rumors about this and so forth. So she would have felt an intimacy with somebody else, anybody else, who she felt actually believed her story and had clear reason to, like Elizabeth. There's no way that these people did not, they're going to have their kids meet. Why would they not? How could they not? I know that it's not for certain, but I would have thought that given the circumstances, they would have thought it would be very important for these two to meet each other and hear the prophecies. It's up to them what they're going to do with it. But now, and I'm making such a point of this because there are scriptures that I'm thinking really of just one, actually. There's only one I could find. There's not a whole lot of talk about it, but there's a scripture in John chapter 1, verse 31, and then it's again in verse 33, where John literally just straight out says, and I knew him not, referring to Jesus, but then I baptized him, and there was this miraculous experience where I saw the Holy Ghost like a dove descending upon him, and so forth. At first glance, that seems to be clearly implying that, or not just implying, it seems to be denoting that John did not know who Jesus was when he came down into the water. So I'm not going to explain this. I think that my good friend Ellicott, who wrote his commentary, a famous commentary, I'm going to quote him because I think he puts things better. He says, the reference in that scripture, John 1:31, is to whom ye know not of John 1:26, and the assertion is not, therefore, inconsistent with the fact that John did know him, Jesus, on Jesus' approach to baptism, Matthew 3:13. in the sense that they did not know him as Messiah standing among them. He did not know him, though with the incidents of his birth and earlier years and even features, he must have been familiar. It cannot be that the son of Mary was unknown to the son of Elizabeth, though one had dwelt in Nazareth and the other was in the deserts till the day of his showing unto Israel. There must have been some kind of childhood experience with them. By the way, that's end quote. It's me talking now. There must have been some kind of childhood experience between the two of them. I would argue, by the way, that they knew perfectly well what their respective prophecies were. That's not necessary, but I think that follows. And the only question then is to what degree did John believe the prophecies about Jesus being the Messiah? It's possible, at least, I think, to know something. You can believe something even, but not to really passionately testify of it. And that's a difference central, I believe, to, say, Søren Kierkegaard's work, where he talks about subjectivity as truth. You can know something objectively, but that's not the same as knowing it subjectively. And so the sign of the dove during the baptism is something John received after Jesus' baptism, which allowed John to be able to testify with a new kind of power and strength. And that's when, for instance, later on, Peter bears testimony. Peter, the apostle, bears testimony of Jesus. And it's like all the apostles are sitting around him. They all know who Jesus is, and they all can say that Jesus is the Messiah. But there's something different about Peter's testimony that Jesus points this out, that flesh hasn't revealed it to him, the Spirit has revealed it to him, or his Father in heaven revealed it to him, sorry. The point being that there's a difference there in how Peter learned it. It was through the Spirit, and I think that's what John meant when he said, I knew him not. He's comparing it to the fact that you guys think you know Jesus, and you may even think that you know he's the Messiah, but until you have that spiritual revelation additional to that, what you've worked out, then it won't take the solid hold on you. I think that's what's going on. Let's move on, because this is going to take forever at this pace. So anyway, the important thing is that when Jesus came down into the water with John and Jesus had an understanding beforehand that Jesus was supposed to be the Messiah, that there were prophecies of that. So let's finish out our portrait of John. First, John's parents were old. They were past childbearing age in a dangerous world, and they very likely died before he was an adult. That's what a couple of commentaries speculate. Nothing's known for certain. But it would make sense, and it's possible that this signaled, whenever it happened, or occurred around the same time that John departed his childhood home to dwell in the Judean desert. And that would make sense in the narrative, that his parents died, and that's why he left the home to go leave. I don't think he would have left his two elderly parents alone at their house to fend for themselves when he's around. I don't know about that, but I'm just throwing it out there. Luke tells us that in chapter 1, verse 80, the young child, referring to John, matured and was spiritually invigorated and was in the lonely deserts until the day he showed himself to Israel. Furthermore, Jesus spent some portion of his childhood before the temple incident down in Egyptian territory, according to the accounts, to escape from the massacre of the children. Eventually, John went into the desert while Jesus stayed in Nazareth, and at some point it is presumable that Joseph, Jesus' father, probably died, because he does not appear at any time after the temple incident. So whereas John had no obligations at home because both of his parents were older and they had passed away, Jesus had his mother Mary to provide for, and she continually pops up throughout the rest of the narrative. But in this transition where John leaves for the desert likely happened when John was already old enough to take care of himself, which leaves us a significant window where the two could become more closely and intimately acquainted. That period before John leaves for the desert and Jesus has returned from Egypt. In any case, John decided that the next step in his journey was to go into the desert. However, the lonely deserts where John eventually went were by no means entirely devoid of inhabitants, although certainly still lonely. And this is a point that's important because it helps to explain why John went into the desert. I don't think it was just for solitude, though that was a part of it. Because we now know that a now famous, strict, and zealous sect of Judaism called the Essenes secluded themselves there in the desert, in the wilderness of Judea. John would have almost certainly had dealings with them. In fact, it makes quite a bit of sense that John went into the desert not to be totally alone, but basically to train with the Essenes. Why? Who were the Essenes? They had broken away from the other main sects of Judaism, like the Pharisees and Sadducees, which they considered, quite rightly, to be corrupt. Among plenty of other things, the Essenes were ascetics, and the sacred ritual of full immersion baptism was selected as particularly important to them. It is therefore noteworthy that both practices became most characterizing of John the Baptist, who was, as we're told by Mark, clothed in hair of a camel and a belt of leather around his waist, and living on nothing but locusts and honey from the wild. Let's talk about baptism really quick, just so that we're on the same page. The 1906 Jewish Encyclopedia, because I think they put it the nicest way, the natural method of cleansing the body by washing and bathing in water was always customary in Israel. The washing of their clothes was an important means of sanctification enjoined on the Israelites before the revelation on Mount Sinai. The rabbis connect with this the duty of bathing by complete immersion. According to rabbinical teachings, which dominated even during the existence of the temple, baptism, next to circumcision and sacrifice, was an absolutely necessary condition to be fulfilled by a proselyte, an initiate convert, to Judaism. End quote. So, in brief, John the Baptist did not invent baptism. Rather, he was a zealous preacher, likely trained among the pious Essenes, seeking to reconvert his fellow Jews to the covenants of their fathers, which reconversion or rededication was signified by redoing a practice already familiar to them, baptism. So it is not at all unreasonable to assume that John communed with the Essenes. I do not think he was utterly alone in the desert for half of his life. Such a lifestyle would turn him into more like a pharaoh loner, presumably, not a fit prophet for a complex community. Once again, it's possible this is wrong, but I think it's a more plausible explanation and a more rich one, to be honest. So rather, John trained and learned from people who, while I'm not saying they're necessarily right on all points, but they certainly possessed far more integrity than the alternative, the teachers of Judaism at the time, and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. From the Essenes, John learned more about baptism and felt inspired to make that the focal point of his ministry as the waymaker for the Messiah. In any case, Matthew reports to us, "Moreover, in those days that Jesus lived in Nazareth, John the Baptist came, publishing in the desert of Judea, and saying, 'Reconsider yourselves, surely it has drawn near the reign of the heavens.' Then went out to him Jerusalem and all the Judea and all the regions neighboring the Jordan River, and were baptized in the Jordan River by him, acknowledging their sins." It's chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. John's actual words here are packed with Greek meaning. The first word is metanoite, which comes from meta, the preposition for afterwards, but also denoting accompaniment with something coming immediately after something. By the way, some of you will know that Aristotle coined the term metaphysics, or actually I don't think technically Aristotle coined it. I think whoever compiled his papers coined it, because metaphysics simply means accompanying or after the lessons on physics, because it's a different kind. So anyway, just a fun little note. Meta, that's what it means. Afterwards, accompanying, coming immediately after. The other part of the word is noio, which comes from nous, which is theorized to come from genosko. Ginosko means to know, but more properly to be aware of, to perceive, to allow one's mind, to allow in one's mind. This supposedly became the philosophically famous noun nous, meaning mind, understanding, intellect. This is the word that you find with Anaxagoras, the pre-Socratic Greek philosopher. Nous, mind, understanding, intellect, the seat of one's awareness or of one's perception of things. So nous turns into the verb noio, meaning to exercise the seat of one's awareness, to exercise or use the mind, hence to comprehend, to give heed, to consider, to give place in the mind to. So you combine that with meta, and you have the word metanoio, which means to consider afterwards, i.e., to reconsider, especially in the moral sphere, which is why I added the word yourselves to make that meaning more clear. One is to take thought concerning oneself. One is to reconsider oneself, one's way of life, one's actions, and to address those things that one sees as unaligned with the truth as one knows it. One carefully considers and works out one's salvation with fear and trembling before God. So John justifies this command to reconsider, to metanoio. He justifies it by proclaiming that the basileia of the uranon engken. Basileia comes from basileus, from basis. Basis means foot. Funnily enough, basileus, so working off of basis, basileus means a sovereign or king. You might be wondering what a sovereign or king has to do with the word foot. So did I, until I found that the idea is a king has the proper foundation for them to rule. That is the proper basis, that is the proper foot for his power. He's got a leg to stand on, without which he would fall. So anyway, this becomes abstracted into basileia, which means the rule itself, or the kingdom of said royal authority. It can also, I believe, mean the royal authority themselves. John specifies this kingdom as being that of the uranon, which is the heavenly vault, the sky, which are common symbols for the place where God dwells, or the heavens. So, it's the reign of the heavens. The reign of a king from the heavens, you could say. So what is this reign of the heavens doing? Engeken. It becomes egos. It becomes near in proximity. It approaches and has already approached. It is at hand. So, John is saying, God's already here. Are you ready to meet him? Are you confident enough in your living as a covenant person in the Jewish faith to meet the God with whom you covenanted? Or is there anything you wish to reform, to forsake, to say, yeah, I'm doing this wrong, help me change it, redeem me of it, I resubmit to thy will? Just to look at what the other gospel writers say about John's preaching, Mark tells us this John came about baptizing in the desert and publishing a reformative baptism into liberation from offenses. So that last part, if you couldn't tell, is usually translated much more nicer and simply as a baptism of repentance for the remission of sins. So the meaning is the same and how I quote translate it, but I just use different wording in order to keep the meaning fresher. So one is reforming oneself through the baptism, having already reconsidered oneself before God. And what does this baptism do that helps the reformation? It brings one into a state of Aphesen, or liberation, forgiveness, freedom, pardon, remission. Literally, the word means a sending away someone from you. You are sending away your debtor scot-free. You're redeemed from the debt. And what is the debt here? One's hamartian, or sins, offenses, failures to hit the mark, and thus not sharing in the prize which would have been earned, or simply erring, trespassing, etc. One could, I think, translate the word as just simply failures, so long as the element of free will were not forgotten there. Anyway, Luke says the same essential thing, and he went into all the regions adjacent to the Jordan, publishing a reformative baptism into liberation from offenses. The subject of his preaching is literally the exact same wording as Mark. This is what John was saying. Now, the story goes that a number of Pharisees and Sadducees, educated and ruling sects of Judaism, we'll get to them in a minute, came down to where John was baptizing. John then addressed a fiery discourse at them. Or rather, Luke and Mark don't mention Pharisees or Sadducees actually conversing with John. So Luke and Mark attribute his discourse about a generation of vipers to just the masses in general. Matthew, however, is often interpreted as seeming to imply that these educated Jews were actually there to be baptized as well, though I don't see that as a necessary interpretation because Matthew only says that they came down to where John was working. John gives us, or the Apostle John, not John the Baptist, but the Apostle John in his Gospel gives us the most insight into their motivations. He tells us that the ruling Jewish priests sent people from their ranks to interrogate John and figure out what he was doing. They weren't there to be baptized, or if they were, quote unquote, they were just there pretending to be baptized so that they could figure out what John was doing. Anyway, who were these Pharisees and Sadducees? There's a lot of things, by the way, I'm taking care of in this podcast because they obviously become very important later, so I'm just figuring I'm going to take care of them now when they first come up. So I'm going to return us to Ellicott's commentary because he does a good job of explaining this. The Pharisees are first mentioned by Josephus as opposing the government of the priest ruler of the Asmonaean house. The Pharisees were the separated ones, and the meaning may help us to trace the history. The attempt of Antiochus Epiphanes, as related in the two books of the Maccabees, to blot out the distinctness of Jewish life by introducing Greek worship and Greek customs, was met with a heroic resistance by the priests and people. The mingling or not mingling with the heathen in marriage or in social life became a test of religious character. The faithful became known as Ascidians, i.e., Chassidim or saints, and looked to Judas Maccabeus as their leader. Later on, as the holding aloof from the heathen became more and more characteristic of the Pharisees, they took the name Pharisees, and under John Hyrcanus become a powerful and organized body, forming a kind of guild or fraternity as well as a party. Like most sects and parties, they had their bright and their dark sides. They maintained the ethical side of the law as well as the sacrificial. They insisted on alms and fasting and prayer as the three great elements of the religious life, on the Sabbath as its great safeguard. They did much to promote education and synagogue building. In gathering the traditions of older rabbis, they held themselves to be setting a fence round the law to maintain its sacredness. They maintained or revived the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead and of the rewards and punishments that were to follow. But on the other side, their separation developed almost into the exclusiveness of a caste. Their casuistry inverted the right relation of moral and ceremonial duties. They despised the mass of their own countrymen as the brute people of the earth. A tradition of uncertain authority and date states that the founder of the Sadducees was a certain Zadok, the disciple of Antigonus, who in his turn had sat at the feet of Simon the Just. Antigonus taught, it was said, that men should not be servants who do their master's will for a reward. And the scholar developed the doctrine into a denial of the resurrection, which formed the reward. Whether this is a true account or not, the features of the Sadducees in the New Testament stand out with sufficient clearness. They are for the most part of the higher priestly order, as contrasted with the more lay scribes of the Pharisees. They admit the authority of the written law, not of traditions. They deny the existence of angels and spirits, as well as the resurrection and the immortality of the soul. They made up for the absence of the fears of the future by greater rigor in punishments on earth. They courted the favor of their Roman rulers and to some extent even of the Herods or Herodians. In my mind, so that's ending the Ellicott's commentary quote. In my mind, I crudely compare the Pharisees to the modern political right and the Sadducees to the modern political left, not in terms of what they actually taught, but just in the temperament of what they taught. So you have stereotypes of the right and the left, and I think that the Pharisees and Sadducees correspond well enough to those stereotypes that I can make a fruitful comparison. So the Pharisees were the stereotypical proud conservatives. So they were the ones who kept the traditions, and they didn't let the corruptive influence of Gentile philosophers or outsiders into their religious lives. They wanted to make Judea great again that way, by separating themselves and saying, we're not like the rabble. The Sadducees, on the other hand, were adapters. They drank willingly from the cup of Hellenized philosophy and justified themselves by cutting through the cobwebs of tradition to what at least they claimed was the original text. I'll be bold enough to suggest that their secret, unrecognized instinct was actually for Judea to slowly die off and just become another country of the world. In any case, the Sadducees had more cutting minds and did not have patience for what they considered silly superstition. But in either case, they were both rather elitist. They both held themselves separate from the, quote, rabble. The Pharisees were the more powerful and plentiful group, but both did hold power insofar as both were officially educated. In a sense, they were the false dichotomy set up within the universities of the time. They didn't really have universities like we think of them, but the point being that in order for you to be educated in Judea, you ultimately had to be educated through either the Pharisaic lens or the Sadducean lens, and eventually you would find yourself siding with one or the other. Any middle ground was made unintelligible, just as most countries find themselves dominated by only two opposing political factions, and no one's really able to get the third party in there. Luke tells us that the people were moreover in expectation, all wondering in their hearts concerning this John, whether he might eventually be the Christ. It's chapter 3, verse 15. John adds to this that, accordingly, the ruling Jews sent to John the Baptist priests and Levites from Jerusalem so that they might ask him, "Who are you?" All right, let's unpack a little more needed background here. Like I was saying in the last podcast, the Jews were masters of saying several related things at once. One favorite topic of the Jewish prophets, particularly Isaiah, was this notion of a Messiah. The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia tells us, the term Messiah is used in the Old Testament of kings and priests who were consecrated to office by the ceremony of anointing. It is applied to the priest only as an adjective, the anointed priest. Its substantive use is restricted to the king. He only is called the Lord's anointed, e.g. Saul or David. The Messiah is the instrument by whom God's kingdom is to be established in Israel and in the world. The hope of a personal deliverer is thus inseparable from the wider hope that runs through the Old Testament. The Jews were a nation who lived in the future. In this respect, they stand alone among the peoples of antiquity. No nation ever cherished such strong expectations of a good time coming, or clung more tenaciously amid defeat and disaster to the certainty of final triumph over all enemies and of entrance upon a state of perfect peace and happiness. The basis of this larger hope is Yahweh's covenant with Israel. On the ground of this promise, the prophets, while declaring God's wrath against his people on account of their sin, looked beyond the divine chastisements to the final era of perfect salvation and blessedness, which would be ushered in when the nation had returned to Yahweh. So Messiah is the one anointed by God to serve as his king and priest over the expansion, consummation, and glorification of God's kingdom on the earth, and the ushering in of a messianic age of peace and enlightenment. The word Christ is the Greek equivalent of Messiah, by the way. The words are more or less interchangeable. Now, the Jews at the time of John and Jesus had been beaten to a pulp. They were quite literally like Captain America, if you've ever seen that first film. being beaten up in an alleyway by these bullies, and yet continually refusing to give in, continually running at his opponent even though he's just going to get his face smashed in again. But why? Because he believes he is a messenger of something bigger than just the present moment of survival. He is the anointed carrier of God's will. He will not back down no matter how beaten and bloody he becomes. And that is what made it so excruciatingly difficult to deal with the Jews throughout antiquity. When John and Jesus were around, the latest empire to try their hand at ruling Judea was Rome. We'll get more into them in later podcasts. Suffice it to say that Judea was always expectant of their redemption by some divine means, always expectant of the fulfillment of God's covenant to Abraham, that it would be the Jews who would bless the entire earth. And now that they were in the gutter again, under the boot heel of the Romans, that expectation for redemption was hotter than ever. When would the Anointed One come? The Messiah Isaiah kept talking about. When will we be redeemed from subjugation by the Messiah? When will God's glorious King come to us again? For remember, the Jewish scriptures work in terms of repeating patterns, or one might more correctly call them retroactive metaphors. One is related not to something that already happened, but to something they believe will happen. So when Cyrus is called Messiah, he is not being compared to past priests who were lesser than him, but to a future king Messiah who is far greater than Cyrus, and that everybody had in their mind from their teachings. If I could pound that in people's heads, eh? People keep talking about it as though, like, this is an idea that developed. No, they already had the idea of Messiah in their heads, and they were referring to these people as, like, it would be, I'm trying to, like, if we had in our minds the notion of a perfect president, right? Like we might talk about George Washington, or like Abraham Lincoln, and say that someone is the next George Washington. And it's kind of like what the Jews are doing, except they're doing it retroactively, where they're saying, we already have this vision of the future perfect president who shall be named Washington. So we're going to name our country Washington because we've had a vision of the future, which is crazy, like in a cool way, I think, anyway. But the notion that it's like this retroactive metaphor, that they say, I've already seen what this future Washington will look like. And this current president, let's say it's Abe Lincoln, is like, people would respect him by saying, you are like Washington, or you are Washington here on earth, even though he falls short of the ideal mark that they already have set in their mind. It's not something that develops. It's something they already had. It's something, if anything, that gets corrupted. If it develops, then that's a problem, because anyway, that's how I see it, and I think it's very important for understanding the way that they thought. They really were a very strange and peculiar nation with very strange ways of viewing things. So, in any case, the notion that a Messiah was boiling in the blood of every pious Jew at the time. And whenever such kind of a mass boiling happens, that means there will be several madmen who think they are the promised Messiah and will try to do just that. They're going to try to rise up and destroy the Romans because everybody's so desperate to become the nation they sort of already envision themselves being. They don't care about going back to the way things were. Like, they do in a sense, but there's still that consciousness of we're supposed to become something better. The Pharisees and Sadducees, I think, are a bit of an exception to this because they'd become so jaded that they're like, no, we just want to keep things stable. Like, we don't want, madmen coming along. So several, crazy people had already tried to be the Messiah before Jesus came along, and they had ended up crucified by the Romans because they're like, no, you're not going to rebel against us. And, that would be enough to jade and quite a few people. But still, the Jews were waiting. Like, so many of the Jews were waiting. They're like, oh, well, I guess he wasn't it. Meanwhile, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, like I keep saying, they had secretly become jaded to the whole Messiah thing, which you can't really blame them. They were the ones in power. They were a few inches from being squashed by the Romans, and they were not keen to give up their positions for every madman who came along claiming to be Christ. So when they sent envoys to speak with John, they were not really asking, as probably they should have asked if they were honest people, "Are you really the Messiah?" As if they had any reason to follow him if he did come. They had no internal intention to really follow a Messiah, even if the real Messiah came. They just wanted to continue with the way that they were doing things. They didn't want someone throwing... Maybe they'd be okay with it if that so-and-so came and flattered them to death. But anyway, when they sent envoys to John the Baptist, that what they're asking is, "Are you on our side? Are you going to cause us any trouble? We don't actually really care what you're doing. We just care whether what you're doing is going to hurt our position." Anyway, John answers, interestingly, "I am not the Christ." But he later adds, "In the midst of you stands one whom you lot know not, and the one arriving after me. I am not worthy to untie the strap of his sandal." It is possible that this is followed by his famous discourse I mentioned before, where he calls them all children of poisonous snakes, and tells them that they must bring forth fruit worthy of repentance, despite being covenant children of Abraham. By the way, this notion of bringing forth fruit for repentance and baptism, that was an estin notion, that baptism is always preceded by this inner, sincere repentance, which is signaled by confession. But in any case, John the Baptist says that his role was not as Messiah, but as the waymaker for the Messiah. And the way he was doing that was by baptism with water, in the manner of a full cleansing ritual, in order to prepare a congregation to recognize and be ready to follow the one who baptizes now with fire and the Holy Ghost. The point here is that John already understood several things. First of all, he knew he was a mere auxiliary to the Messiah, the washing of the vegetables before cooking them. That's kind of a grim metaphor, but it's the only one I had. Second of all, John had some spiritual indication that the Messiah was in the crowd, or at least among the people he was preaching to, or even just in Judea in general. If we already know that John and Jesus had some form of familial ties and almost certainly knew each other reasonably well, if not extremely well, then it is quite reasonable to say that John understood Jesus specifically was supposed to be the Messiah and was actually referring to him when he was talking to that group of people. And much like the boy Jesus who stayed behind in the temple to see how his parents reacted, Jesus once again did something unexpected and arguably improper in order to test a loved one's understanding of things. Jesus went in to be baptized too. Jesus did not stand up and say, "That's enough out of you, John. I'm the Messiah, and so I'll be calling the shots now. Good work, pat on the back." No, he didn't do that, which almost seems to be that's probably what John was expecting. Something more clear and dramatic, but that isn't what Jesus did. And given that Jesus knew both John's preaching and John's character, then we may reasonably conclude that Jesus did this all intentionally, expecting John to be thrown off balance by it. It is now easy to see all the pathos involved in John's statement from Matthew. It's like he's saying, "I have obligation to be baptized by you, but you come to me?" In other words, what the heck are you doing, Jesus? Didn't you hear a word I just said? Didn't you, of all people, pick up on the subtext? Where I was like, "There's one among us who is the Messiah, and I'm not worthy to unlatch his sandals." Like, that's not even subtext. Like, I was talking about you. I wasn't talking about the person standing next to you. Like, why are you coming to me to be baptized when I just said that I'm not worthy to do that, basically? Did you forget who you are? All these other people need to be baptized, not you. You're different. That's the whole point. I refuse to baptize you because you're going to screw everything up. Like, no, you're confused. You're going to get me to do something that is wrong. You got caught up in the moment and think this is a good idea, but you're mistaken or something. Now get out of my river. Sorry, that's being facetious, but you get the point. And I can understand that because this is how John understands it. But here's the profound irony. And once again, Jesus, in my opinion, proves to be just so penetratingly intelligent in a way that could be frightening to people. There's a profound irony here. And I think that it's what Jesus was exposing by doing this. Because for John is refusing to baptize Jesus on the grounds that Jesus is above such things. He's above John's authority, and John ought to be baptized by Jesus. But is this not precisely what the Pharisees and Sadducees think of themselves, as the doctors of the law? And is that not what John was just chewing them out for? If you're familiar with the scriptures, you know there's that one scripture which I've re-rendered here. John says to the Pharisees and Sadducees, You're children of deadly snakes. Do not presumptuously say within yourselves, A father we have, Abraham. Indeed, I say to you that God is able out of the stones right here to rouse up Abraham children. Those are fighting words. And he says that with the implication, you have to have an internal conversion. You're not entitled to anything. So he said that to the Pharisees, but he clearly does not think that about Jesus. Jesus explains to the affronted John that even he himself, the Messiah, is not above the divine law. He's not entitled to things. He did not get off scot-free because he was the Son of God, fascinatingly enough, but rather he was to perfectly submit to the law, and by so doing prove his authority. In Plato's Republic, the proud sophist Thrasymachus asserted that justice, that is, moral law, is merely what those in power dictate to those subject to them, but do not follow themselves, because it would put them at a disadvantage. So often, I think we think of God that way, as being a figure above the laws he expects us to follow. Yet Jesus asserts that, on the contrary, he is perfectly able to follow the law, and that is precisely why he had the authority to give it. A master bicyclist, for instance, is perfectly able to pilot the tricycle that they give to their student, even if they have moved on to more refined, vigorous, perfect versions of the tricycle. There's a story about the prophet Joseph Smith that I think is even more relevant here than talking about Thrasymachus and them. And I think this might actually better get to the point of what was going on here with Jesus and John. The account is taken from the autobiography of William F. Cahoon, who was one of the original Mormon converts who dealt directly with Joseph Smith. And if you don't know who Joseph Smith was, well, I mean, you can look it up and you'll find all kinds of things about him. All kinds of fascinating things and contradictory things. He's the founder of Mormonism, and I'm Mormon, so I've learned a lot about him. The story goes, and this is from the autobiography, this is William F. Cahoon, I was called and ordained to act as a ward teacher, that is, a teacher to the group of people who were in the church. So his job was to visit the families of the saints. I got along very well until I was obliged to pay a visit to the prophet, Joseph Smith. Being young, only 17 years of age, I felt my weakness in the capacity of a teacher. I almost felt like shrinking from my duty. Finally, I went to the door and knocked, and in a minute the prophet came to the door. I stood there trembling and said to him, Brother Joseph, I have come to visit you in the capacity of a ward teacher, if it is convenient for you. Joseph said, Brother William, come right in. I am glad to see you. Sit down in that chair there, and I will go and call my family in. The family soon came in and took seats. The prophet said, Brother William, I submit myself and family into your hands. And Joseph took his seat. Now, Brother William, said he, ask all the questions you feel like. If you know anything about Joseph Smith, by the way, he's like I'm almost certain that he was an ESFP. He's like Tony Robbins or something. He's so energetic and so happy all the time. Anyway, you can read it in that voice to yourself, just so you have a picture. So anyway, by this time, my fears, this is Cahoon talking, my fears and trembling had ceased, and I said, "Brother Joseph, are you trying to live your religion?" He answered, "Yes." I then said, "Do you pray in your family?" He answered, "Yes." "Do you teach your family the principles of the gospel?" He replied, "Yes, I am trying to do it." "Do you ask a blessing on your food?" He said he did. "Are you trying to live in peace and harmony with all your children?" He said that he was. By the way, this isn't anything that Mormons do now, but it's an older form. This was like kind of procedure for them. I'm not sure what the specifics of the procedure were, but like this is like a matter of course that you would ask questions like these when you were doing this duty of visiting the people. Then he turns to Sister Emma, who was Joseph Smith's wife, and said, "Sister Emma, are you trying to live your religion? Do you teach your children to obey their parents? Do you teach them to pray?" To all these questions she answered, "Yes, I am trying to do so." I then turned to Joseph and said, "I am now through with my questions as a teacher, and now if you have any instructions to give, I shall be happy to receive them." Joseph said, "God bless you, Brother William, and if you are humble and faithful, you shall have power to settle all difficulties that may come before you in the capacity of a teacher." I then left my parting blessing upon him and his family as a teacher and departed. And that is the story of how a 17-year-old exercised his rightful authority over the prophet who technically gave him that authority in the first place. It's interesting. He submitted himself to the law, and I think that's exactly what Jesus was doing with John. But anyway, let's break here and talk a little bit about some of what this might imply about Jesus' personality. I'm actually not going to be giving it, like the last one, I was kind of like, "He's INTJ, can't you see it?" And I'm making fun of myself for it, even though I still have suspicions of that, but I'm not going to be making any assertions like that because I just don't have enough information. But I am going to talk a bit about like just the personality in general, and we can see what fits where. So the degree of assurance that Jesus gives to John, saying in multiple different ways, "Don't worry, just do it," I think that's characteristic of Matthew's gospel, which continually emphasizes how Jesus' entire life was in accord with the prophecies of the Messiah and the dictates of the Jewish law. As IDR Labs asserted, Matthew's gospel was written for the SJ temperament, which would be most impressed and concerned about Jesus' willingness and ability to submit to law, tradition, and due process. The story in Luke would likely have scandalized them. Thus, different writers emphasize different things about Jesus, just as we often do with any historical figures that we really like and therefore naturally like to think that they were like our personality. Nevertheless, looking through that, if we just simply look at what Jesus did, we find that same independence expressed by his stunt in Jerusalem, I think anyway. Jesus continually clashed with the expectations of those around him. He did what everyone else thought was actually blasphemous, but which he himself knew was really the opposite. And he wasn't very good about explaining his intentions, except at the critical moment when he was already doing it. Let me rephrase that. It's not that he wasn't good about explaining himself, because that implies that he wished to explain himself, but he was somehow prevented from doing so. I simply mean that he just simply didn't explain himself. Because I don't know, I'm just thinking of John, like poor John, like there in front of everybody, and then Jesus comes down, and John has just been surreptitiously implying that Jesus is the Messiah, and Jesus is like, "Well, if you're really holding to the principles that you've been given, then you'll baptize me." And John having to realize this in front of all these people. I don't know. Maybe I'm putting too much story in there, but that's how I see this happening. Like, he really puts John right on the spot there. Like, and it's hilarious in a way for me, because it's like John's like on the same side as Jesus. Like, they're like tight, but he still tests him. So anyway, Jesus could have There's no indication the baptism was private. I don't know. That's just how I see it. And Jesus was a profound teacher in that way. He likes to test people. He likes to experiment with them and even shake them up a bit, given, of course, that they're already strong enough to handle that sort of thing. And John was certainly strong enough for that. If anything, John was strong. In John's case, Jesus knew that John was surreptitiously assuming an elitist attitude regarding the Messiah, so Jesus, accordingly, went forward to question that notion in the most graphic and memorable way, through performance art, by putting John on the spot, not hypothetically, but in reality. And all these things, actually, as I'm saying it, it's like, okay, so this actually implies more of like an SE type, like an SE thinking type, like an ISTP or ESTP. I recall that description that Luke gave about the developing Jesus in the last video, that the welfaring of God was upon him. The grace, the cheer of God was one of the possible meanings there. So whatever personality Jesus had, at least what we've seen so far, he doesn't seem to me to have been what people might call a worrywart. To be sure, he was very ponderous. He had a lot of deep feelings and deep thoughts and deep concerns. He was a deep thinker, and he had... But that's not the same as having anxiety, which I don't think is something that he really had, because he could sleep well at night, I think. But he didn't have, like, these unwanted thoughts that were dragging him back. He had this ability to to be able to test people like that. I think maybe I'm emphasizing this because it's just something so utterly... That's not something that I could ever really do. Like, I can't test people. And I don't recommend that people test people. I think I'm giving Jesus the go-ahead for this because he knows people and he's incredibly smart and he keeps doing it in the right way. But I don't like it when people try to test me. I want to be... I'm a communicator, and I want to be on the same level as other people. I struggle to be... Like, I can't even really be sarcastic. Maybe you've noticed this, but, like, I struggle to be sarcastic because I have to... It's like I feel this compulsion to stop and be like, I'm just kidding, just in case you didn't realize that. But I'm not seeing Jesus having that. He seemed to have this profound ability to test people by not letting all of his intentions be known. Maybe not quite like that, but that seems to be what happened with the temple, and that seems to be what happened here. And it's brilliant and it's profound, and it's decidedly not something that I'm really able to do. And I don't think that it's a very INFJ thing. I know that a lot of people type him as INFJ, and that's still possible. Anyway, I'm only 2 stories in. You ought to draw your own conclusions. But next time, we're going to be talking about the temptation in the desert. And oh boy, do we have a lot to talk about with that one. So I hope you enjoyed this and found it interesting, enlightening, thought-provoking, and I will see you in that next video.